How's it going, everyone? Later, Gonzalez exploring Next.js 13, specifically what is the problem that it solves, and what is the value proposition, as well as now understanding is the foundations from this and all. In this case, Next. So what is the aim? So what is the value proposition of Next, as well as the Next 13? And then now we're going to explore is this React server components where everything forward is so everything forward here is a foundation of what's coming next. Okay, so everything forward is based on this foundation. So as a way to just briefly explain what Next.js solves, and it is that with React we have this framework that allows to now create all of this user interface. So it's a wrapper around the DOM that by exposing is the create elements you can now have is your HTML tag or custom tag, and because it is quite tedious to do that, any time to actually call JavaScript to create a component, that's what we use this JSX, right? JavaScript extend syntax, JavaScript and HTML. So for that, then we need is to define is a transpiler. That anytime we wrote our code in JSX, we can is now translate that into the proper JSX file. And also we need some sort of guideline, guidelines, code styles. That's why, for example, ESLint kicks in. We need some sort of linter to guarantee the correctness of our programs, especially for common error. This is also known as a formal language, which is from the computer science, and also is the ability to formatting our code using printer. And now, how are we going to include all of our components in a way that is make it much more easy to manage, right? We need an architecture, a folder structure, and also a folder structure initially, and then an architecture on how all of these components is going to communicate. So what are the state that we're going to use to do that? What are the tools that we're going to use to that allows that? Use a state, use reducer, use effect, use ref, use layout effect, use memo, use callback. What are the kind of subtle things that we can do, and what are the specific use cases for these tools? And when it comes to compose more and more and more and more React components or UI elements, we need to find a way to make our the complexity manageable. So we need some sort of first way of how we can pass data through all of these different components, whether it is using context or state, and again, what is it, or a redux, what is a specific use case for that. And if it wants to now verify that our UI actually works, what it does, we need to use unit testing, not only to check the functionality of our code, but also is the component, the UI component, so we can get the value proposition of test is that we continuously verify that things won't break behind our back. So we have now unit testing to do that, which is verify that that particular function in JavaScript works as expected. And then we have now concepts like referential equality or value equality, and some of these different methods that we can go using Jest as this testing framework. And for the component UI, we also need is some sort of wrapper around that, because since unit testing's run is on JavaScript, we need to now run our component is not on JavaScript, but is on the platform that it needs, where the platform where it renders, and that is a DOM. So that's why we have now a DOM representations run or built in Node.js, like a GS DOM or Happy DOM that allows to mount all of these components, and now by wrapping them into a library that exposes the most common operations, for example, query elements inside of this UI, or exposing methods, common recurring methods, typing, scrolling, key up. So we need to actually also integrate that. And if you want to now make your code not only self-documented, improve the developer experience by providing us this IntelliSense or auto-completion features, and understand the data flow, so errors can happen at build time, not at run times. So you have now TypeScript for that, and you have to define TypeScript and also understand how TypeScript it is, which is this superset of JavaScript. So, and also depend on the type of application that you're building and how you want to render this application, whether it's on the client, on the server. If it is on the client, we need some sort of router for that, for example, React router, and also some way of fetching data using its actions, or some library out there that when writing React application, for example, with use effect, we have now is this particular hook to communicate with external services. So it can be from browser APIs or for external for service. And we need to handle some of these particularly issues that we have as we build our applications, such as, hey, network duplications, because anytime the user now hit this navigate to a URL, the client or the server render the server now send the HTML, and behind the scenes is now hurrying up everything in the background by loading JavaScript and parse it while showing a loading screen to the users. And then when everything is done, the page becomes interactive, visible and interactive. And this is great for this kind of applications at the client side, because now it improves the user experience, because pretty much everything is there. And anytime you need to call is data, you use now a use effect for that, this synchronization process, where you can start and stop a synchronization process. So fetch data, for example, and because this code now run on the client side, this network duplication, it means that the user, let's say the user navigate to an e-commerce, that e-commerce actually send everything that it needs to the client, show a loading screen, and in the background hurry up everything else with JavaScript and loading and parse that, the page becomes visible and interactive, only to realize that now it needs to fire up an AJAX request. Okay, so this is network duplication. Not to mention the network waterfall, because it's all of this component actually now fetch different data from different resources on the internet, then you considerably slow down your applications. There is no catching mechanism built in React to do that. And that's why we have now some catching mechanism with frameworks like React Query, for example, or Redux as well. Because anytime a user get into a page, get out, and come back, it need to actually is fetch that Ajax request, and also it raise conditions. Like, hey, if a user is typing that and then search that, and if doing that too fast, then we need to actually implement that kind of logic and behaviors. We use for that is now an observable, for example, Next.js, all right? As a way to now is make sure that these series of eventual values are sending that properly. And this is just for the client-side rendering navigation. And then we have now the server-side rendering. Because what happened is with this, with the CRS rendering mode, we have now all, the content is not present. So robots or the web crawler need to take a look at each one of those websites for the full content of fully rendering, so they can now rank there according to their known checks. So if they're not, of course, you'll have some tremendous SEO penalty. And there's some sort of hacks, some way to deal with that kind of stuff. So, for example, detecting if if this request come from a crawler, then pre-render that content if it is. If it's not, then send that as the client-side navigation. And in the server-side rendering, we say, okay, no, let's make the initial request pre-rendering on the server, send that to the client, show something to the user, show something to the user, while in the background now is downloading the JavaScript code that is this is the client-side representation of our components that takes over and grant interactivity. So this is just to describe all the things that we need to, in 30 minutes or in 10 minutes, all the things that we need to put in place just to write an application. Oh my, French toast guy, bro. And this is only for developing applications. You know what I mean? So when it comes to say, hey, how are we going to then integrate that code? That's a separate beast. And this is part of the continuous integration, continuous delivery. But what we care about here is next is to recognize all the things that I have mentioned, okay? And all the things that we need to think about it. We're now next say, hey, let me now provide you the infrastructure needed, or this basic installation that you needed to start now writing your applications in React, okay? So Next 13, okay? So Next.js 13 would say, hey, previously we have a way to now routing our applications, okay? But now here, from 13 and on, we have now this particularly more convenient way to writing or to define our routes, file-based routing. So there's some nuance in there as a way to how you're gonna pass, how you can group routes through parentheses, how you can define the routes in your inside of that group routes, uh, how you can is now pass dynamic data to those routes, this log, and how you can now include that route page to pass the data, how you can get that data from that, in the fundamental, which is something that exists, and the fundamentals of what is this things called React Server components. Because traditional React components actually, as the name suggests, is they're gonna render on the client, right? This is where you can use JavaScript, all that kind of stuff. Now there are these components, React components that are run on the server, where the idea is to now some of these problems of for data fetching and catching. Now, in the case of data fetching, is make it close, so put it closer to the data source, and for catching is make it easy for those components to be catched on the server. And that is quite a lot. That's quite a lot. Absolutely, that's quite a lot. So be able to describe that, and then understand how we're going to set up our projects and what is the folder structure that we can go with, and then now the layout and styling, and how now per file or per route you have now some common React components that you can go with to handle some common use case. For example, layout or the template. And the sole difference is that layout is a static, where now template is dynamic. You can re-render here. The error, the not found, the loading screen, among other features. So they provide you now this convenient files per route to help us cover most of these common use cases. And how now here in Next.js, everything is statically rendered by default. So it means it is catch, and they did that because some of their, so the next team actually wants to promote is the optimization out of the box. And if you, for example, need to use some of the particular methods or hooks, let's say cookies, headers, and use search parent, you switch that to dynamic routing. So we also look at the layouts and all that kind of stuff, and the stylings, and how can we actually start to write our own components, or use whether it is CSS model or CSS in GS. How now CSS model actually is generating is a class followed by a hash. So you have now a unique class for that. And then finally, what we care in today's video, which is now server components. Okay, so let's get into this. Let's get into this. Okay. Server.
All right, now we get to talk about fetching data and server components and client components. All right, let's get to it. So we talked about server components. As a refresher, server components are components that run on the server. They literally execute in the node environment, which means you can do node things. The other thing, though, that you might have thought about,
and that's pretty silly, right? The server components are components that run on the server. So you in Node.js, so you can do node stuff.
You didn't know this is how this worked, but because they only execute on the server and they're not in like React's context of change detection and virtual DOM and all that stuff, they don't opt into the same behavior as a regular React component. So you might be asking, what is a regular React component? Okay, let me ask you this. I'm just gonna write a component. You don't have to follow along here if you don't want to, but I'm gonna make a.
Yeah, that's interesting because they don't follow on the normal or on the client. Okay, they don't follow on the client side React mechanism. Okay, where you have now the trigger or the virtual DOM and something that he mentioned, right?
So you might be asking, what is a regular React component? Okay, let me ask you this. I'm just gonna write a component. You don't have to follow along here if you don't want to, but a component. So you might be asking, what is change detection? And
exactly, change detection and the virtual DOM. So for example, is that they don't follow on the client side React mechanism, such as the trigger, triggering, rendering, and committing phases, right? And all that involves, which is the trigger detections or event, it's like the triggering and that change detection and the virtual DOM. So change detections in the virtual DOM. Okay. So therefore, you can use is now use state for the React, for example. So therefore, you can't use React tools. What is this? But this is the fetch. No, server components. So React server component, React.def server component. React.def server component. Server components. There you go. So yeah, let's go to read about this. The server components are a new type of component that render ahead of time before bundling. It's important to understand this. Ahead of time, so at compilation time, before bundling in an environment, before bundling in an environment separate from your client or server. These two stuff here are very important. So it renders at compile time. Anytime when they say this, it's like it's quite annoying when they say this. It's very quite annoying. When we say renders ahead of time, it means that statically, exactly, static site generation in this case, that render ahead of time So happens at build time, not the same as compilation time, and create a static HTML that can be catched. Exactly. This is this. So that renders ahead of time, okay? It means that before build time, or it happens at build time, exactly, before bundling, so server components are a new type of component that render ahead of time before bundling in an environment separate from your client app or server-side render. So yes, so this kind of components actually by default runs in this on the server, on the node. If you can specify where these components can be rendered, whether it's on the client or on the server. But if this is on the server, you can do node stuff for that. So server components can run once at build time on your CI server, or they can be run. So server components can run once at a build time on your CI server, or they can be run for each request using a web server. Interesting. And here's the distinction here. So server components can run once at a build time where your CI server server components can run once at build time, on your CI server, okay, or they can be run for each request using a web server. So server components can run once at build time of your CI server, or can run for each request using a web server. Run on each request. Run for each request. Run for each request using a web browser, using a web server. And this distinction is important because when you do this, you're actually running is using these static site generators. So you at build time, that's when you have with this ahead of time, you generate all of these React components on the server, okay? So you have now these static site generators. For example, like this particular docs might be kind of like that. So you can inspect that, and then you say, hey, anytime you actually change that, you just only get is that particular data as is. Here now the download is the layout, and some kind of bundle here. That's quite interesting. So for example, in the docs, where of course they need to download that, but as you can see here on image, CSS styling is part of internal actually as a way to fetch that data. So they have now is okay. So for example, static assets, third party, internal, memory use, internal. But as you can see, it's downloading is this type of data as a JSON. So this is now using this web server. In fact, they're using is Next.js behind the scene, Versal and Tailwinds for that. Anyway, so it's all right. Okay, good. So how do I build support for server components? Good question. Is they say, hey, to support React Server Component as a bundler or framework, we recommend pinning to a specific React version or using Canary release. We will continue working with bundlers and frameworks to stabilize the API to go with that. So here we look at an example here, right? Server component within a server, which is that kind of stuff, right? And on the endpoint, this is when you're going to send that data as it is. So this pattern means user needs to download and parse. Yeah, this pattern means user needs to download and parse an additional 75 kg zip because it's now loading is this mark as well as the sanitize. And all of this happening is at the at the client side, right? And wait for the second request to fetch data after the page load, which is in this case here, just to render static content that will not change for the lifetime of the page. Which server components can you can render? Yeah, which server components you can render these components once at build time? Okay, with server components you can render these components once at build time, but the problem that we're solving here is this, especially if you have now your client-side libraries all in your client-side React components, you define some sort of imports, in this case like mark and sanitize. So the more libraries you need to call and then fetch some data, the slower that application becomes, or the more load are on the more load is on the client side, okay, only to render this content. And if this content doesn't change, anytime you get into this component, it will actually have to do this. So you don't only have the problem of the loading dependencies, but also is to not having the ability to catch this content here. At least this is in plain React, right? So with server components, you say, hey, this component now will be rendered on that. This is not included in the bundle. Note loads during render when the app is built. Okay, when the app is built in the server, I want you to now get this and then generate this static content as it is. So the render output can be server side rendering to HTML and upload to a CDN. So when the app loads, the client will not see the original page component, which is this, or the expensive libraries for rendering the markdown. The client will only see the render output, which is this one. And that's right. So the client will now, which is a great stuff, if you have server components, the client will only see if the rendering output is static HTML. This means the content is visible during first page load, and the bundle does not include the expensive library needed to render the static content because it already pre-rendered that. You may notice that server components above in async function here. So async components are a new feature of server components that allow you to wait in render. See async component with server component below. But okay, server component with a server. Okay. So server component with a server. Server components can also run on web server during a request for page. So because this is not only rendered on a CI/CD process. Okay, so not only run once at build times on your CI server, but also during requests for a page, letting you access your data layer without having to build an API. That's way interesting. So letting you to access the data layer without having to build an API. They are rendered before your application is bundled. It can pass data and GSX as props to client props. With those server components, it is common to fetch dynamic data on the client in an effect, which is exactly what we have here. So this is the bundle here. We're gonna call this data, right? Similar for this. Node loads after node renders. Exactly. Causing an expensive client-server waterfall. In this case, I'm going to now call or load the author after this component has been rendered, causing an expensive client-server waterfall, which is this. And then you need to define is your route for that. With server components, you can read the data and rendering it in the components. Exactly, because at the end of the day, all of these components now, they don't render on the client. The render is on the server. Again, this is to solve Facebook problems. This is to solve Facebook problems. Node loads during render. Node loads after node, but is fast if data. Okay, with server component you can render this. Nodes load after the node, but it's fast if data is co-located. The bundler then combines the data, render server and dynamic client components into a bundle. So then it's combining, the bundle then combines the data, rendering server components and dynamic client components into a bundle. Optionally, that bundle can then be server side rendering to create an initial HTML. But this is optionally. The bundle can be server side rendering to create the initial HTML for the page. So when the page loads, the browser does not see the original node and author components. Only the rendering output is sent to the client. But again, with server components, you can read the data and render in the component. Hey, I want to do node stuff. In this case, render the data or read the data and rendering in the component. Okay. This is interesting. When the page loads, the browser does not see the original nodes and author components. Only the rendering output is sent to the client. So when the page loads, the browser does not see the original node and author components. Only the render output is sent to the client. But again, this is optional. The bundler, whoever bundler might be, then combines the data, renders server component, and that's why they're collaborating with bundlers here. To support React Server Component as a bundler or framework, we recommend pinning to a specific React version or using the Canary release. We will continue to working with bundlers and frameworks to stabilize the API. So for example, Next They collaborate with that. Or any other bundler. So for example, Metro bundler. So Metro is now for React Native. You know what I mean? It's like, this is quite interesting. So that's what they working together with them. The JavaScript bundle for React Native. Okay. No, you know, so these bundlers, all right, and the bundlers are those frameworks or libraries that now comprise everything here. That's interesting. Mm-hmm. Okay. The bundler. All right. So the bundler now takes all of these different data and they now produce is, okay, and package them into an optimized bundle for production. Mm-hmm. So now the bundlers that combine all of this data into an optimized bundle for production, it combines the data, the render server components, and dynamic client component into a bundle. So now the data, render server components, and dynamic client components are into a bundle. Optionally, the bundle can be server-side rendering to create initial HTML for the page. So when the page loads, the browser does not see the original node and author components, only the render output is sent to the client. So server components can be made dynamic by refetching them from a server where they can access the data and render again. This new application architecture combines the simple request and response mental model of server-centric multi-page apps with the seamless interactivity of client-centric single-page apps. Okay, giving you the best of both worlds. So this is a way of how they combine this new way of building applications in React. It's just to combine is the simple request and response mental model of the server-centric multi-page apps with the seamless interactivity of the client-centric single-page app. So they want us to now combine is the different rendering modes, or in this case is the multi-page app, the mental model of multi-page app with single-page with the interactivity of single-page application. Adding interactivity to the server components. Server components are not sent to the browser, so they cannot interact API like uses state. So therefore, that's why here, because since server components are not sending to the client, all right, since they're not sending to the client, you cannot use interactive API. You cannot use interactive APIs like use state, for example. Because behind the scenes, optionally, the bundler, because behind the scenes, the bundler that takes is the server components, the render server components, a dynamic client component into a bundler that you can tell to the bundler, hey, I want to server-side render. I want to now server-side render this and create the initial page that is going to be sent. So since service components are not sent to the client, you cannot use interactive API like useState. Since service components are not sent to the client, because you can optionally tell the bundler to server side rendering you cannot use interactive API like useState. Adding interactivity to server components. So to adding interactivity to that, so if you need to provide interactivity to the API, you use now a directive for that. To add interactivity to server components, you can compose them with client components. So if you need to provide interactivity, you can do that using this client side. You can by using a directive called client use client. So by default in Next everything is that, and this is how you can now provide this. You say, hey, this is something that I want to render on the server, okay? So it's going to render all of its content in the server, and on the client side now you're going to provide the interactivity to this. This works by first rendering node as a server components and then structure the bundle to create a bundle for the client component expendable. In the browser, the client component will see the output server components page as props, like this. This is the bundle for the client component. Hey, this is the bundle for the client components, and you're gonna see now all of this components rendered. And the client component will see output of the server component passed as props. Async component with server components. So this is how it's gonna look like behind the scenes. When you want is to now is combine the server components with all of the data, okay, followed by the interactivity to those in each one of those components, expendable. So you have expendable key, and each one of them they have their own. Okay, async components. So async components with server components. Server components introduce a new way to write components using async and await. When you await in an async component, React will suspend. But this is async component with server components. Okay, React will suspend and wait for the promise to resolve before resuming render. This works across server client boundaries with streaming support for suspense. React will suspend. That's interesting, but this is on server components. React will suspend and wait for the promise to resolve before resuming rendering. So if you do something like this, in the server, in the async component with async component with server components, you say, hey, I want to wait for this data to be loaded, and by the time that is done, also this one that depends on another one, and then combine that with suspend, which is this React component that allows you to now show something while doing an async operation. And this is the fallback. So hey, when you do not render is this comments, comment promise. And you say, hey, client components, I want to use this data that come from this. Note this will resume the promise from the server, and it will suspend until the data is available. And once the data is available here, then you do that. That's quite interesting. Okay, let's now get a more practical approach.
Client components. So client components are the same things that you already know.
Okay. 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 All right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. So, so now we are understanding what is doing behind the scenes. So that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.